Our first speaker is Erika Hall. She is the co-founder and director of strategy at Mule Design Studio in San Francisco. Erika is also the author of 2 books, the ever-relevant and recently updated Just Enough Research, as well as her new book, Conversational Design. Conversational design is also the topic of her talk. It's not about designing interfaces that we chat with, but using human communication as a model for interacting with any system. So let's hear from Erika Hall how we use the art of communication to elevate technology.
Good morning, Business Tibetans friends. I'm Erika Hall, co-founder of Mule Design Studio, coming to you from my secret headquarters here in San Francisco. And I'm so glad to be here spending time with you virtually today. So, I'm going to begin with a bit of a sad story. I once worked with a client in the entrepreneurial division of an enormous international publishing company. They had developed a semantic search engine to help get business people get more value out of the news by making intelligent connections among stories, but no one was getting any value out of it because the interface was so complicated that virtually everyone who landed on the homepage bounced off immediately like a pigeon on a plate glass window. And the clients came to us and they said, we need a little bit of help with this because clearly something went wrong with our magnificent interface. And I said, well, it's kind of complicated. So while we're getting started, why don't we just add a couple sentences of introduction, copy, instruction there to the page to explain people what amazing things are happening on this site and why they should pay attention. And the creative director said, oh no, we talked about that, but we can't figure out what to say. We went around and around and couldn't decide. And I said, you know what? It's the internet. Because it's the internet, you can change it tomorrow, change it the next day, find out what people need, find out what people are confused by, change the sentence. It's just part of the design. Oh no, he said, those are words. Words are part of publishing, and we're a publishing company, so they have to go through our editorial process. It takes 6 weeks to get approvals, and then we can't change anything. I said, no, words are part of the design. Just like the pictures or the menus or anything else, the code, it's just a part of that. And they said, oh, that's not how we see it. So a short time later, they went out of business and I wrote a book. As someone who likes to talk, but hates to talk on the phone, I've been interested in the relationship between human communication and technology for a long time. A while back, I wrote a talk called Copy as Interface to convince designers that words are the most important part of interaction design. And as technology progressed, instead of interface designers avoiding words, the problem has been organizations creating conversational interfaces that are more difficult and annoying to use than plain old web pages. We need to take a deeper look at what conversation is and how it works so that we can better apply those principles to our systems and make things that are genuinely conversational and are easier to use. We're in a weird place now. When I type at my friends and talk at computers, and my friends are pretty much indistinguishable from machines. Is it a human? Is it a chatbot? I don't know. They look exactly the same. And at this point, graphic designers expected that we would have completely eliminated words and only been using cool icons and gestures. But it turns out that words are the most important part of interfaces. Verbal expression is the one thing that stays the same across devices and across modalities. But verbal language even though it's what makes us human and separates us from all other species. It's the one cool thing we can do that other animals can't do, except maybe corvids. I'm betting that corvids secretly have verbal language and we just don't know about it because they're super smart. Words still freak us out a little bit. So let's look at why. I'm going to take you on a very quick tour of the entire history of human communication. Hang on. So, we have been talking a really long time. Writing is so hard that as a species, we put off writing for as long as possible. We've been talking for maybe 200,000 years, maybe more, maybe 300,000. There's no written record. So we don't actually really know. We just have to kind of look at evidence and, anatomy in the fossil record and try to figure it out. So 200,000 years, 300,000. We've been talking a really long time. So maybe like 45,000 years ago, cave painting. Well, we call them cave paintings because the ones that survive the elements are in caves. The same reason we talk about cave people, because we find artifacts in caves, because anything that was left out in the open air or got kind of soggy isn't going to persist. So fine. Graphic design arrived first. So there's a reason we're a lot more comfortable with pictures than with writing. So as human society got more complex, the way we needed to represent it did too. So that was like 45,000 years ago, figurative painting. Flash forward many millennia to 6,000 years ago. The first appearance of what we would consider writing. Ancient Sumerian commodities traders got tired of being ripped off, so they hired scribes to make wedges in mud to keep accounts. So the first thing we wrote was basically QuickBooks. We call these marks cuneiform because that means wedge-shaped. They're like little tortilla chips. So, by conservative estimates, we've only had any kind of writing at all for 2 to 4% of our entire time being human. Wow, we put writing off a lot. Alphabets representing individual sounds with symbols instead of whole concepts, so we could have far fewer symbols, only 26 in English. Pretty efficient, but some languages like Chinese went in a different direction and still have every character for a word, and it seemed to work out for them. But alphabets made things kind of efficient. So we had alphabets for roughly 3,000 years. Even after these innovations, reading and writing were still the tools of the elite for a good long while. As you might recall, learning to read and write kind of takes a lot of time and focused study, and writing by hand is really time consuming. And what were they going to write on? Clay tablets, a lot of work. Papyrus only grew in some wetland areas. Parchment and vellum. I hope your ideas are important enough to kill an animal for. Want another copy? Kill another animal and handwrite it. So, for this reason, the introduction of paper and then movable type printing to Europe, putting each letter form on a different little block you could move around to form separate pages and print books really, really quickly, that sped the process up a whole lot. But that was only 1450 when Johannes Gutenberg figured that out. Of course, the Chinese invented porcelain type, movable type, around the year 1040. So they kind of got there first, even though there aren't really any extant books from this period. Again, our thinking is biased by what artifacts survived. So, Thomas Gutenberg was a big deal. The so-called Gutenberg Revolution actually led to a lot of real-world revolutions because all of a sudden, regular people who weren't in the elite could share ideas across borders. And the sharp increase in literacy broke the monopoly that the elite had on education and learning and boosted the middle class and led to a lot of actual revolutions. This was literacy at scale. and it accelerated the pace of all other technologies. It changed the culture, radically changing human society and how we related to one another. Because once we were able to write things down, we could actually study complex ideas and make abstractions. It changed who we were as a species. Oral culture, the culture based in speech, is really different from literate culture. Once we could encode knowledge in a portable physical object, we invented privacy. A feeling of completion was possible. So you could own ideas, you could be finished with ideas because they were there in a complete physical object. Writing ends. It's done. It's final. It's in its final form, at least that edition, in the way that our friends at that business publishing company thought about it. You know, the way that they thought about putting words on a web page was a lot like what it's actually like to put words in a book. You can't just suddenly take a printed book and say, oh, you know what? I'm just going to add a little bit something to that after it's been printed and distributed out in the world. That's not how that works. Before literacy, words were ephemeral and knowledge was social and communal, and remembering things required other living human brains to store those ideas. There was no save. So poems constructed of formulaic blocks of metaphors were a really important part of preserving knowledge. If I knew anything about Old Norse poetry, I would say something here. Similar principles apply. Quotes are a very powerful way of preserving knowledge. We still love quoting books and movies to each other to this day because that's baked in as a way humans share knowledge. Before literacy, all knowledge was communal and social and contextual. Words were ephemeral. Once you said a word, it was done. It was out there. It was actual physical action that left no documentation. It was an event. But once we could record our thoughts in a thing totally separate from a living human brain, our thoughts totally changed. They got long-winded. You know, Benjamin Franklin was considered a very pretty witty individual. We had new worries like, I'm communicating with you. What if the documentation of my communication falls into the wrong hands? What if an audience it wasn't intended for sees it and holds it and saves it and shares it to somebody else? This was impossible with spoken communication. Once we had writing, we could put thoughts inside our thoughts. Like here in Moby Dick, Herman Melville stops mid-sentence to put another sentence in his sentence. This sort of reflecting on our ideas, actually impossible before we could write our ideas down and reflect on them. After literacy, you could be a long-winded bore who lived hundreds of years before your reader, and your ideas would still survive as long as you used high-quality paper. The values of the two cultures are very, very different. Oral culture is immediate and direct and social and participatory. Literate culture, always mediated by an object. That's the defining characteristic of literate culture. There is an object in between you and another human, and that object stores the ideas. It stores the thoughts. So all of a sudden, we had authoritative sources we could refer to. I mean, all of a sudden, after many thousands of years, that sort of all of a sudden. We see these values even in our online communication. It doesn't matter if the words are written in pencil or spoken aloud or typed on a screen. You can tell oral culture communication from literate culture communication. Slack's tagline, be less busy, very direct, very immediate, context aware, leverage innovative market-specific solutions. It would have been impossible to formulate this thought before we had writing. It kind of makes you nostalgic for the times before we had writing, doesn't it? Oral culture always has an audience in mind, and it always speaks directly. Literate language just kind of lays there. It's documentation, not communication. In oral culture, you can only communicate if everyone involved is actually alive. We read books by dead authors all the time. And this is why talking is so much easier than writing. Writing is an unnatural act. It's really hard, and you have to think about all possible future audiences. That adds a lot of stress. So we have a love-hate relationship with writing. It's powerful, but it makes us miserable because the stakes are so high. And you just think about anybody could be reading this and judging me based on this document that might not even be for them. But because we could document and study complex ideas and record them across time and distance, technology accelerated. And this brings us to the big twist. Because we could write things down, because we could have more complex thoughts, all of a sudden, after this was the sudden, because of literacy, we were able to develop communication technology that allowed us to once again be present with one another across time and space. Suddenly, through radio and then television, we could have simultaneous shared experiences. American children's television legend Fred Rogers considered everyone his neighbor, and everyone in his audience felt like he was a guy in the neighborhood, even if they were thousands of miles apart. And even today, we watch his shows after he's passed on and still feel like his neighbor. So take a moment to think about the big picture. It took 300,000 years of Homo sapiens to get from talking to writing. Just a few thousand after that to get to mass literacy. And then, just in the past couple hundred years, we went from sending dots and dashes across a wire to being able to do live video conversation. In hindsight, literate culture now seems like an annoying phase we had to go through so we could get from campfires to TikTok. So, if you're feeling a little bit of technology whiplash, this is why. It's wild in terms of human history, how quickly the technology accelerated. According to scholar Thomas Pettit, we didn't have a Gutenberg revolution so much as we had a Gutenberg parentheses. There was just a quick 500-year stopover so we could develop reading and writing that would help us get back to being part of one global present. And that's really what we're experiencing now. The Reverend Walter Ong is a scholar and a Jesuit priest who studied with Marshall McLuhan, and he coined the term secondary orality to describe the technology-mediated new way of all having an oral culture that's not really, because it's based on literate culture, together. He said, orality knits persons into community. The more our communication resembles oral culture, the more it ties us together in this sense of shared present. And because he was an academic who worked really in the literate mode, secondary orality doesn't really roll off the tongue, but I haven't thought of a better phrase. So we're in this situation where we're typing to each other, writing, I guess, kind of, but it feels a lot more like conversation than writing. But the technology kind of gets in the way and can change the message and add strange humor by correcting it, by referring to an authoritative source, which is a very literate way of being. Autocorrect can change the meaning and introduce humor of conversations, which can then be saved as documents. This is a world of communication so weird, we haven't really dealt with the ramifications. There are new forms of literature like Texts from Dog, which is a story presented as a series of screenshots about the relationship between a man and his dog who texts. It's British. It's pretty funny. Newscasters read tweets on the news, on video, and then we can screenshot them and save them as documents. It's wild. And we just roll with it because conversation is so much a part of who we are that you can ask a question in words with your voice. You can type it. You can send it as a voice text, and somebody can reply to any of these with a short video meme, and it'll totally make sense to you. So, conversation. We've been practicing it for a couple 100,000 years. We're so good at it. We don't stop to think how it works, but we should, especially if we want machines to do it on our behalf. We can't just teach machines to talk the same way we teach people to talk by sitting them down next to us when they're children and picking it up. That's not how it works. Conversation starts with a shared goal. Without a shared goal, you get a total breakdown. If you go in a strange city and need directions, you can get them really quickly without having to have some sort of complicated interaction with a stranger. They just understand from the context what you need. Paul Grice, the British philosopher of language, came up with the principle of cooperation based on studying pragmatics, how people use language in daily life, the verbal and nonverbal parts of it. And ironically, this is a very literate formulation of this concept. Make your contribution such it is required at the stage at which it occurs by the accepted purpose or direction of the talk exchange in which you're engaged. Yeah, that's a mouthful. Another way to think about it is read the room and pitch in. Look at the context and do your part. He came up with the 4 Gricean maxims: quantity, quality, relation, and manner. This just means for conversation to be functional, all parties need to provide just enough info, be truthful, be relevant, and brief and unambiguous. You can tell if you've had a functional conversation or a not functional conversation right in the moment and use these maxims to figure out why. He was kind of missing one though. Paul Grice didn't say anything about being polite, but Robin Lakoff did. She's a UC Berkeley linguist who did work in gender and communication, and she added the maxim of politeness, which is the quality of showing respect and creating a good feeling for all participants. This is another important principle to think about when you're designing interactive digital systems. So, conversation works when it's cooperative and goal-oriented and fast and truthful and turn-based. It's very important. It's only a conversation if everybody takes their turn. Otherwise, if one person keeps talking, it's a monologue. And polite and error tolerant. If you're a good conversationalist, you don't bring the conversation to a halt because one of the participants used the wrong word or couldn't remember something. You help them out. You keep the conversation going. This is something that a lot of so-called conversational digital systems are terrible at. So because we know that people are good at talking to each other, and there have been huge advances in machine learning and cloud storage and processing speed, there's a lot of enthusiasm for conversational interfaces. Like in this quote that says, machine intelligence is making applications smarter and conversation is the new interface. It's not. It's the oldest interface between humans, and machines just get it wrong. It's not necessarily the best interface if it's more effort to use. A lot of times conversational systems are as much conversations as painting a door on the wall just turns the wall into a door. It looks like it should work a certain way, but you end up running into the wall and wishing you just had a simple website to use instead. A lot of times, a simple website can be more conversational than a so-called conversational interface because it isn't about the mode. It's about the principles. It's about being cooperative, goal-oriented, fast, turn-based, truthful, and polite. And of course, error tolerant. Very important. Google search is one of the most conversational systems of all. This basic web search interaction has been around for more than 20 years. It's highly conversational according to these principles. It's so fast, it tells you how fast it is. It's very error tolerant based on trillions of searches that it's learned from. And it's turn-based. You put in a query, you get something back, you reflect on that, maybe you put another query, maybe you click on a link. It works just like a conversation. But up until recently, it didn't talk, so we don't think about it like that. But that's why it feels so easy to use, and that's why Alphabet, Google's parent company, is worth a tremendous amount of money, because they figured it out at the core. So if software is on a path to participating in our culture, it should behave like a person. This means being participatory and present and feeling like living humans who are working on the system. It doesn't necessarily mean imitating human conversation. It means using the principles to be more humane. Because humans and computers each are good at a different thing. More or less. This is a vast generalization. But humans tend to be better at figuring out other humans' emotions and having empathy and knowing the context and making the case for something, for your ideas, persuading somebody. Unstructured solving is something that humans tend to be much better at than computers. Figuring out a problem that you've never encountered before, or doing something kind of ambiguous, like if you're asked to make a room cozy or evaluate a candidate for a job or decide whether a proposal's ready for a client, or deciding what information is relevant to include in that proposal. Those are things that humans tend to be much better at than computers. We're worse at remembering, calculating, logic, precise repetition. These are things that computers tend to be super great at. So why don't we let them do the things they're good at? Because humans and computers work better together when we divide the labor up in a way that allows different people and different systems to do what they're best at. And it's always better if we humans put humans first and don't just build the systems that are exciting to build because of the technology and then call them conversational because they seem like it on the surface. No particular system is better than any other. No channel is better than any other. Is a website better than an app, better than a customer service rep, better than a smart speaker? It all depends on whatever is the least effort for the customer and whatever feels the most cooperative. Too many systems are still designed around the new technology, not around humans. We need to ditch the idea of computer literacy, which is, as Alan Cooper says, just a euphemism for forcing human beings to understand machines rather than having the machines stretch to meet the way people think. And this makes more work for the designers and the businesses, but isn't this why we're doing this at all? There's no one right channel or mode. The right way is accommodating conversations that cross channels and cross modalities. We have to do the work, even if the work is to get over ourselves and realize that providing the right words at the right moment is more powerful than any technology that gets them there. We have to figure out what matters for any particular goal and context. That's what makes a system conversational. You have to know your role, know the role of the system, and know the value you're providing. Conversational simply means being context aware, no matter what the technology. This means letting go of our old familiar processes and our hierarchies and our silos and our sources of expertise that when we look at them, we'll find are all based in the values of literate culture. We need to move forward to be truly, deeply conversational and reconnect with our deepest, most fundamental selves. In exchange, we regain that intimacy and humanity, and the technology will help us be and act more human with each other. And remember, please don't tap on Erika. Thank you.